Hello and welcome to the Starting Admech series, where we cover everything from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between. In this video, we're going to look at the heavy support choices for the Admech army, and as I mentioned in the previous video about the fast attack choices, the fast attack choices are probably the best choices within the Admech army. However, if any slot can give it a run for its money, it would be the heavy support choices, which can be argued to be either as good or better than the fast attack choices. And in this video, we'll include the flyers within the heavy support choices, just because there's only 3 heavy support choices and 3 flyers, though many of the heavy support choices have different build paths. And I should mention, all of the heavy support choices do see tournament play with at least one of their loadouts, and 2 of the 3 flyers see tournament play as well. So as you can see, there's a very heavy magnitude of play within this slot. The way this video is structured is that first we'll look at the 3 heavy support choices, covering them from most played to least played in tournament settings. Then we'll look at the flyers in the same manner, so we'll kind of break it up into 2 sections. And once again, just because I mentioned tournaments a lot does not mean that the information here is specifically for tournament play. It simply means that I'm using that as the metric to go by, as it's the easiest metric to use. Much of the information provided here will be applicable to other situations. It's just harder to use them as a baseline due to their subjective nature. And before getting into the different units, I would like to say this: as all of these units are equipped with heavy weapons, it should go without saying that they all benefit from the Mars Forge world due to the Canonical, as the Canonical is good on anything that's a heavy weapon. So instead of reiterating that with every single choice, I'm just going to say right off the bat that all of these picks are perfectly fine in the Mars Forge world and benefit from either the Stratagem or the Canonical in one way or another, as well as Call. So just keep that in mind while this video is going. First on our list is going to be the Skorpius Disintegrator. This is by far the most popular choice within the Admech army, as even after the points increase going into 9th, which is rather significant, this unit still remains as a very popular choice within the different lists of the Admech, and it's not uncommon to see 3 of them within a list, which is the maximum you can take. So clearly, even with the points change and everything else going into 9th, this still remains an incredibly heavily played unit, just to attest to how good it is. There are 2 different weapon loadouts you can choose for the Skorpius Disintegrator. Each of the choices come with 3 heavy stubbers and a Disruptor Missile Launcher. The Disruptor Missile Launcher is actually an incredibly powerful weapon that just comes with the unit naturally, as it has almost the same profile as the Eradication Beamer on a Dunecrawler, although it has -1 strength, which is an important breaking point, but it's something you shouldn't discount when using the weapons on this model, as it can do a lot of work. The first choice, and probably the correct choice for this model, is the Belisarius Energy Cannon, and the Belisarius Energy Cannon is a rather strong choice. It's a little more mid-range than the other choice, but on the low end it will have the same amount of shots as the other choice, and on the high end it will have triple the shots, though on average it will have double the shots. That's not all the Belisarius Energy Cannon brings. It actually brings with it the ability to ignore line of sight, so it can shoot at models that it cannot see, which is very important in 9th edition with the terrain and objective changes that occurred. Additionally, it's the only source of ignoring line of sight for the Admech, which makes this weapon a very unique ability within the army, and that's always something to consider when a weapon has a unique profile compared to all the other choices you have out there. It's usually going to be something that you want to take a look at and consider, as opposed to a weapon that is more similar to other options you can already pick up in other places within the army. I should mention that in 9th edition, the Belisarius Energy Cannon became a blast weapon. However, as its baseline stats are 3d3 shots, meaning that you roll 3d3 dice and you combine the 3 rolls into 1, and the minimum is always 3 shots. It doesn't benefit from shooting at the first breakpoint of blast because it always has 3 shots naturally. It's not that you get 3 shots per die, it's that you get 3 shots total for the weapon as a minimum. So yeah, it doesn't actually benefit from that, but it does benefit from the maximum amount of shots when shooting at a larger squad. So keep that in mind. It's something that some people make a mistake with, thinking it gets way more shots than it actually does when shooting at a mid-sized squad for blast weapons. Now the second choice is the Faramite Cannon, and while this has a longer range, more strength, more armor penetration, and more damage overall than the Belisarius Cannon, the issue with it is that it's still competing with things like the Stratoraptor or Las Cannon Iron Striders, so there's a lot of places where you can pick up a similar weapons profile, whereas the Belisarius has that unique ability of shooting without line of sight, and this makes the Belisarius a lot more of an interesting pick over the Faramite, despite being a weaker weapon overall, because being able to ignore line of sight can be game-changing within 9th edition. Finally, to wrap up the Skorpius Disintegrator, the Skorpius Disintegrator has the triangulation stratagem, which costs 1 command point, and it states if you shoot all 3 weapons at the same target, you add +1 to the hit roll. Now, this ability isn't particularly that great. because most of the time you're not going to be shooting all 3 weapons at the same target, as not only because the Belisarius cannon ignores line of sight, and this sometimes makes it impossible to shoot the other 2 weapons at the target that it's shooting at, but also the 3 weapons have rather distinct profiles, so a lot of times if you do shoot all 3 weapons at the same target, you're throwing away some amount of shots because the target's probably not going to be affected by them. So most of the time you're not going to use this unless it's critical to make sure you get that +1 to hit, and there are just better ways of generating +1 to hit within the Admech army. It's a nice stratagem to have in case you really need to use it, but it's not something you should really be focusing on most of the time. After the Skorpius Disintegrator, the next most popular heavy support choice is probably the Onager Dunecrawler. The Onager Dunecrawler is the least expensive heavy support choice on its own, and it comes with a lot of firepower. Additionally, unlike the Skorpius Disintegrator, it comes with an invulnerable save of 5+, and the Ammonatus field has an extra ability, which states if there are 2 Dunecrawlers within at least 6 inches of each other, both of them can reroll 1s when they're taking their invulnerable save. This is a nice perk to have if you're already planning to take 2 Dunecrawlers. However, it's only a 5% increase in survivability when looking at invulnerable saves, so it's not something you should tunnel vision into and specifically take 2 Dunecrawlers just to have. It's more of a bonus that you're not paying for in points that you should always think about. Though when you do have 2 Dunecrawlers, do keep in mind that this exists and it does add that tiny little bit of survivability. The Dunecrawler has a total of 4 different weapon loadouts, and I would say 3 of them are something you can consider, while the 4th isn't playable at all in my opinion. Let's take a look at the different loadouts from best to worst. The best of the options is obviously the Icarus Array, and the Icarus Array is something that's very interesting, as it's a bit of a unique weapon in that it has 3 different profiles that it shoots simultaneously, so you can shoot all 3 profiles whenever you're in the shooting phases, as opposed to having to pick one. And the weapon profiles range from okay shots to rather heavy firepower shots, and as a whole the Icarus Array for the Dunecrawler can put out a ton of firepower for a surprisingly low cost in points, which makes this the most popular option. Now, the Icarus Array has one other ability in that it's designed to shoot down flyers, so when it shoots at a flyer, it gains +1 to hit, bringing it up to potentially 2+ on its top bracket, and this can actually be very significant as there are some armies that utilize a lot of flying units, and flying units are perfectly fine, so it is an extra perk that does matter at the end of the day. However, this doesn't come without a downside. The downside is that when you're shooting in non-flying units, you get -1 to hit. This used to be a much bigger deal prior to 9th edition because back then, minus modifiers could stack, so if they had a -1 modifier and you had your -1 modifier, you'd be gaining -2 to your roll. However, going into 9th, it caps out at 1, so you're at most ever getting -1. So all of a sudden, when you're shooting at a unit that already has a -1 modifier for whatever reason, you essentially lose nothing. And this was a buff for the Icarus Array, which was already a good weapon prior to 9th edition, and the Dunecrawler didn't see a big boost in points going to 9th either, so this became a lot stronger than it once was in 8th edition, for example. The second weapon might surprise you, and the second weapon is actually the Eradication Beamer, and a lot of times people will say that the Neutron Laser is the more popular option, but I think this weapon gets a lot less consideration than it should. The Eradication Beamer is essentially a worse Neutron Laser when it's shooting within 12 inches, however, when it's shooting beyond 12 inches, it does have the potential of getting more shots and will on average have more shots than the Neutron Laser, which is important as at the end of the day when you do the math on it, they have comparable damage against most targets because one gets more shots and one gets less shots. And it became a blast weapon going into 9th, so now it can benefit fully from the blast weapon changes. So to say this much, I think the Eradication Beamer is much better than people give it credit for, and it is cheaper than taking the Neutron Laser, and that's what makes me feel like it needs a little more consideration, and we might see it pop up a little more going into the future. Then in 3rd place or in 2nd place, as both these weapons are kind of comparable, the Neutron Laser is great for its heavy firepower, but it does only have D3 shots, which means a lot of times you might end up just missing with this weapon, and your Dunecrawler essentially does nothing. More so, you're forced to take a Cognis Heavy Stubber with it, which is nice because it gives you a couple extra little weak shots, but it does act as sort of a tack since you don't really need the Cognis Heavy Stubber at all on the Dunecrawler. It did become a blast weapon going into 9th edition, though it is D3 shots, so it doesn't gain as much of a benefit from it as other blast weapons, while additionally you're never really going to be shooting this at something that would benefit from the blast weapons due to how powerful the profile is, so most of the time you're going to be shooting at heavy armor targets, whereas the Eradication Beamer is slightly less powerful and has double the shots on average, so it's a little more likely to be shot at a swarm unit and benefit from blast changes. Again, both are okay weapons, and there are places that they would be played in, but I would generally prefer the Icarus Array in every situation right now, just due to how powerful the Icarus Array actually is. Now, the fourth weapon is the Twinned Heavy Phosphor Blaster. The problem with this is at 115 points, it only gets 6 shots from a Heavy Phosphor Blaster essentially with this weapon. Now, if you look at something like the Kastelan Robot, the Kastelan Robots with 3 Heavy Phosphor Blasters gain more shots and cost about the same. So when you're taking a minimum squad of Kastelan Robots, you've paid roughly double the points, but you've gained 3 times the shots, and their other abilities let them gain even more shots, so sometimes you're getting up to 6 times the amount of shots for double the points. So it doesn't ever really make sense to take this weapon in comparison to taking something like the Kastelan Robot or even the Archaeopter Stratoraptor, because they have this weapon but are just way better and are comparable in points. Maybe we'll see a change in the future so it's more comparable to those. You can additionally take a Cognis Heavy Stubber in addition to any of these weapons, even the Neutron Laser. So in that case, you'll end up with 2 Heavy Stubbers instead of 1. For the cost of the Heavy Stubber, it's okay if you're just looking to waste some points. I wouldn't really take this unless I have extra points to waste. It's not particularly good, and if you're taking something like the Icarus Array or one of the other weapons, you end up having enough shots with them that the additional Heavy Stubber shots aren't going to make much of an impact in the game. Again, it's nice to have when you do have it, but it's not something that's mandatory. Finally, to wrap up the heavy support choice, we come to the Kastelan Robots. The Kastelan Robots are rather powerful and just as good as most of the other options on this list. Though they are less popular than the Skorpius Disintegrator, they're probably about as popular as the Dunecrawler. The Kastelan Robots come with an interesting loadout in that they come with a primary weapon and then a secondary weapon that you can choose from, and they also have an interesting invulnerable save that says when someone shoots at them, if they roll a unmodified 6 for their invulnerable save, they actually reflect a shot back to the shooter and deal 1 mortal wound to that shooter, which can generate quite a few mortal wounds against certain types of shooting attacks, which is pretty good. They also have 3 different protocols, the first being a +1 to their invulnerable save, which they start in. This gives them a 4+ invulnerable save. The second protocol being a double shoot protocol, but they cannot move. So what happens is they can shoot all of their weapons twice, but they can no longer move while they're in this protocol. And the third being a double fight protocol, where they can make double the amount of melee attacks, but cannot actually shoot any of their weapons if they have any shooting weapons. They start in the invulnerable protocol, and you can change their protocol with a datasmith. However, it is a very slow way to change the protocol, and it can fail. In addition to that, you're required to take a datasmith, which is a rather bad option. So most of the time, people use the stratagem Binaric Override to instantly change their protocol, though the downside is that they're stuck in that protocol for the rest of the game. The reason this is important is because if you play incorrectly and you switch them to the double shooting protocol, your opponent now knows where they're always going to be sitting and can play around them a lot easier. So what you want to do is you want to make sure when you do use this, you position them such that they're going to have a lane of shooting for the rest of the game instead of just doing it randomly, or you're doing it to take out a priority target, as they'll pretty much delete anything they shoot at when they're in this protocol. Now, in terms of their weapons, they have the primary and the secondary weapon as mentioned previously. The primary weapon is either 2 heavy phosphor blasters or 2 Kastelan fists. You cannot mix and match the fists and phosphor blasters. You have to take 2 of each, no matter which one you pick. The secondary slot is 1 additional weapon, which is either a heavy phosphor blaster or a flamer. The most popular way of building Kastelan Robots is by taking 2 heavy phosphor blasters as their primary weapon and as their secondary weapon taking the 3rd heavy phosphor blaster. This gives them a total of 9 heavy phosphor blaster shots, and when they're in their double shooting protocol, it gives them 18 shots per model, which is absolutely insane for the weapons profile that they have, though this is the most expensive loadout for them, and they do become rather expensive at their points cost when you're playing them this way. The fist build is also an option that some people have tried a little more at the beginning of this edition, though the problem with it is that the Kastelan Robots are somewhat of a slow-moving unit when you consider everything, and they cannot board transport units, so they have to pretty much make their way across the field. While they have decent stats, they are a big target, meaning that people can either kind of avoid them or shoot them down in many cases before they make it into combat. And one other thing to consider is you cannot avoid taking the secondary weapon, so you end up with that secondary weapon that cannot be used if they go into their double fight protocol, which means you're essentially losing all the points you paid for it. The double fight protocol is pretty good due to how powerful their fists are, but it's definitely a little awkward paying 15 points or more for one of the weapons and then not being able to shoot it at all. Don't also forget that these guys are vehicles, so they can shoot in melee combat, meaning that they're not stuck if they're armed with phosphor blasters trying to swat enemies down. They can actually put out their same amount of firepower if they get locked into melee combat. They're just more limited in terms of what they can shoot. Now, while they do benefit from Mars in a lot of different ways, as mentioned in previous videos, they do benefit from Lucius as well, because Lucius lets them teleport into battle, and because they can be bullied somewhat, by being able to teleport, you do give them a lot more ability to have the first round of shooting very easily, while giving them a lot of ability to position themselves when teleporting in to get the best lines of fire in case you want to put them into the double shoot mode right away with a stratagem and keep them there. Not to mention that the Lucius Canonical does work with their invulnerable save, because even though the Lucius Canonical is capped out at 4+ invulnerable, what happens is the Lucius Canonical brings down their 5+ invulnerable save down to a 4+, and then what happens is the Aegis protocol actually just adds 1 to the die roll. It doesn't modify the save, so what happens is you roll a 3, it modifies it to +1, which brings it up to 4, and this in turn actually gives them a 3+ invulnerable save without violating the canonical rules that Lucius has. I will mention this though, and why they're kind of lower on the list than the other choices, is they can be a trap unit very easily, because as mentioned before, they can be bullied, and they don't have the best profile. Not to mention that if you roll poorly and they explode, they can actually start a chain reaction, though in addition to all of that, they do cost a ton of points, so it's very easy to invest a large chunk of your army into a very small amount of models. So all of a sudden you might find that you're having a hard time getting objectives or doing other things because all of your points are in a squad of essentially Kastelans. So just keep all of that in mind and think about how you want to use them if you do want to use them, because you'll be eating up a lot of points in your army with these guys really quickly, and you can easily find yourself in a bad situation if you're not keeping in mind what their limitations are, especially if you misplay with that stratagem and realize that all of a sudden 400 points or so models can't do anything for the rest of the game. After the heavy support choices, we come to the flyers. There are a total of 3 different flyer builds that we can have, and they all build from the same kit, which is the Archaeopter kit, and they're very easy to swap between in terms of magnetization. Now, because they all build from the same kit, they actually share a lot of the abilities. Before we go into each individual Archaeopter build, let's take a look at some of the abilities they share in common. The first ability, and the one that's the most exciting probably, is their ability to pivot, because a lot of flyers don't have this option. And what it is the Archaeopter moves up to 50 inches within its top movement profile. And what it can do is at the beginning of its move, it can pivot 90 degrees, but it can also pivot 90 degrees at any point of that movement. So you can move in very interesting L shapes, giving it a lot of maneuverability for a flyer, and giving it a lot of capability that a lot of other flyers might not have. Another ability that's shared between all of the Archaeopters is that they all have flying, obviously, but they also have hard to hit. So enemies shooting at them gain -1 to hit. Once again, think about something like the Icarus Array. This gets negated by that. This is one of those models that's pretty good that actually the Dunecrawler with the Icarus Array has a little bit of a benefit against. And finally, the ability all 3 of them share is the command uplink, which can be upgraded to a chaff launcher. And what the chaff launcher does is it reduces damage by 1 when enemies are shooting at them. This is a nice item, but the problem is you have to give up the command uplink for it, which is used for a certain stratagem, which all 3 of them have access to, that can be very good. And additionally, the chaff launcher is kind of expensive for what it is, because the Archaeopter already has a decent amount of survivability. So it's something you can consider and take in some cases, but I wouldn't take it in every case, because the Archaeopter already is going to be a rather annoying model for your opponents to deal with, and if it isn't, the chaff launcher isn't going to be that big of a difference. So personally, I'm not a big fan of it, but I can definitely see places where it would be good, so there's definitely consideration for it as well. Out of the 3 different builds of the Archaeopter, the first and second slot probably compete very heavily for the first place, so they're very comparable in that sense. But out of the 2, I would say the Fusilier is probably the better of the 2, which is the bomber ship. And the reason for this is that the Fusilier is less points than the Stratoraptor, which is the gunship, and it has more unique abilities, whereas the Stratoraptor tends to compete a little more with other gun platforms, as mentioned previously, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means that when you look at the bomber, it brings a little more to the table in terms of what it can do for the army that the army can't do otherwise, whereas the other one, while being very good, can be replaced by other options without necessarily leaving you bereft of some special ability that you might really want. In terms of weapons, the bomber comes with 4 heavy stubbers, and the stubbers are not really what you care about. They're more of a nice little bonus to have, but what you're really looking at is the bomb rack. How the bomb rack works is that if the Fusilier moves over an enemy unit during its movement phase, it can select one of the units it has moved over within that turn and drop its salvo on them. When you drop your bombs on that unit, you count the number of models within the unit you're bombing. You roll 1d6 for every model within that unit to a maximum of 10d6. For every 4+, you deal 1 mortal wound. So this is the ability to put out a large amount of mortal wounds on a squad. If you think about it, on average against a 10-man squad, which is the cap, you'll be putting out 5 mortal wounds, which is quite a lot of damage for how many points the bomber costs. And it does benefit when you're bombing monstrous creatures or vehicles as you roll more dice because it's only 1 model, but it's so big. Keep in mind though that there is no limit to how many times you can use this weapon within a game. You're limited to using it once a turn, but you can keep using it every single turn. A lot of times weapons like this will have a limit of, 3 uses or 4 or 5 uses, but with this one you can use it every single turn, which is kind of cool. Additionally, the bomber has a unique stratagem which is called Seismic Bomb. For 1 command point, whenever you move over a non-Titanic unit, you can drop a Seismic Bomb on it, which says that the unit is shaken and moves at half speed until your next turn in any movement profile. This means moving, advancing, and charging are all halved for this unit that the Seismic Bomb was dropped on. And this can be a rather big deal because if you drop this Seismic Bomb on a unit that's very melee oriented, that's very powerful, you can potentially buy yourself an entire turn before it actually reaches your lines, and that can really swing a game. So this is actually one of those special stratagems that can be incredibly powerful, and you should really think about whenever you're running this model, because don't forget you're already moving over a lot of heavy priority targets due to the mortal wounds that this unit can generate. And finally, there's one other stratagem that this model can use, and this is the stratagem that all 3 different Archaeopters can use, though it does require them to have the command uplink, so you cannot use it if you've taken the chaff launcher. And for 1 command point, this stratagem states that any enemy units that remain within 6 inches of the Archaeopter lose all aura abilities until your next turn. In most cases, you're not going to use this to remove offensive aura buffs, because all the enemy has to do is move outside of that 6-inch bubble and they regain all of their aura buffs. However, if you do want to use this to push an enemy off a position or lose all of their aura buffs, this is something you can do in order to kind of annoy your opponent. But normally what you're going to do is you're going to use this to debuff defensive auras, in that you move the Archaeopter in position, activate the stratagem, remove whatever defensive abilities those models might have, and then you shoot at them in the shooting phase with your models before they're able to move out of it on their turn. This is actually a really powerful ability because all of a sudden you can remove all kinds of survivability from enemy units. I will mention that this is probably better on the gunship than on the bomber, because the bomber is going to be moving around and trying to position for different bombing runs, while the gunship can move up to an enemy unit, use this ability while shooting at the enemy units that it has now removed the defensive auras of, kind of doubling down on its own abilities. So just consider that this is more of a gunship stratagem than a bomber stratagem, but it's usable on both of them and it's perfectly fine on both of them. After the bomber, we have the Archaeopter Stratoraptor. The Stratoraptor is the gunship build. It's a pretty powerful build. It does see tournament play, and you will see lists that run 2 Fusiliers or 1 Fusilier and 1 Stratoraptor or 2 Stratoraptors, though the Stratoraptor is less popular because, again, it competes with a lot of other heavy firepower choices. Though it does bring a lot of heavy firepower to the table, it costs the same as a Skorpius Disintegrator with Belisarius cannon. But unlike the Skorpius Disintegrator, the Stratoraptor is a little more survivable, and it's armed with 2 heavy phosphor blasters, 2 heavy stubbers, and a twin Cognis las cannon, which is essentially a double las cannon. So it definitely has a ton of firepower, and it's only a little more expensive than, let's say, a Dunecrawler. A lot of the special abilities have already been covered, but it does have a special stratagem, which is Raptorial Strafing Fire, and all this says is for 1 command point, it gains +1 to hit when shooting at non-flying units. This is a perfectly fine stratagem. It's a little boring, but it's something that is nice to have, as sometimes getting an extra +1 to hit is rather nice. It's nothing that's amazing, but it's definitely good. I will say this, if you're not playing Mars, but you're playing something like Data Horde, the gunship and the bomber can definitely go within the Data Horde Forge World just to get that extra feel no pain from the primary dogma that the Data Horde Forge Worlds gives, and that's kind of a nice little bonus. It's not going to significantly change how this unit performs, but again, it's just a little extra bonus to its survivability, and the Archaeoraptors are already very survivable, so that just adds to their ability to kind of pester your opponent. Now to continue the hierarchy of the Archaeopters, it goes Fusilave, Stratoraptor, Paperweight, Transvector. Unfortunately, that's just the case, as the third build of the Archaeopter, known as a Transvector, which is a transport model, is really bad for how many points it is. It's a little less points than the Bomber, and it's a little more points than the Dune Rider. The problem is that it can only transport 6 models, unlike the 10 that the Dune Rider can transport, or the 12 that the Drill can transport. And the issue is that anything you're transporting is generally going to benefit from having a larger transport capacity than the faster movement speed. With a smaller play space in 9th edition, the amount of movement you need is not as critical as it was before, and even before 9th edition, the extra movement of this model was not as good as having the extra capacity of the other models. Not to mention the Assault Drill can deep strike, and you can still use things like the Styges H stratagem on your transports to move them up more, so you're really not gaining that much by reducing your transport capacity and paying more in points. Not only that, but the only weapons that the Transvector comes with is essentially for heavy stubbers, which is rather underwhelming for the amount of points. So maybe if it had the ability to transport larger models that, let's say, the Dune Rider or the Assault Drill couldn't transport, let's say Kastelan Robots or something like that, it would be much more of an interesting pickup. But right now, as it stands, it just really doesn't do enough, and it costs more points than it really needs to. The nice thing is, though, is that you can magnetize the Archaeoraptor very easily to switch between all 3 different builds, so even if in the future, or if you decide you really want to try this one out, you can easily do so with really minimal effort. You know, it's a nice little bonus to have. You're not really losing anything by having this as an option if you already want the Archaeopter for the other 2 builds. Anyway, that's the end of this video. If you're interested in seeing more, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and have a great day. Bye.